Hello and welcome to the Smarter Conversations podcast, where we'll be weaving together voices from the cotton supply chain. This podcast is brought to you by the US Cotton Trust Protocol. I'm your host, Kathy Smith. I'm an independent freelance journalist. This podcast series does exactly what the name implies. I'm going to be talking to some of the key movers and shakers in the global textile supply chain to dig into the world of cotton. Well, today we are on the 6th episode in our series, and we're focusing on the important links between academic research and the cotton growing in the fields. So what does the latest scientific research tell us, and how does this relate to what we see happening on the US Cotton Trust Protocol farms? So that's the question that we're asking today. And joining me are two distinguished academic members of the US Cotton Trust Protocol board. First of all, we have Laurie Duncan, who is Assistant Professor and Crop Sustainability Specialist at the University of Tennessee. Hello to you, Laurie.
Hi, Kathy.
Great to see you. And Marty Matlock is the Executive Director of the University of Arkansas Resiliency Center and also Professor of Ecological Engineering in the Biological and Agricultural Engineering Department. It's a very long title, Marty, but it's very good to have you here.
It's an honor to be here. You know, the longer the title, the less the qualified person. So,
well, I don't believe it for a moment. But anyway, let me start with Laurie, because I think I want to ask both of you this question, but I'll start with Laurie, because I want to know a little bit about what your research is about, particularly obviously in the area of cotton. What are you working on, Laurie? I know it's crop sustainability, but give us a bit of an insight into your life.
Well, thanks, Kathy, and thanks for having me today. So my passion is really helping to find solutions at the interface of ag and the environment. We do that by communicating, listening, and educating. With farmers, this means using tools like those created by Field to Market to really assess the sustainability of their operation and then dive deep into potential technologies and practices that could help them meet their sustainability objectives. So whether we're looking at precision ag technologies like drones and remote sensing, or cover crops or edge of field practices, it's important to identify and discuss the benefits and challenges of incorporating those into the cropping system. Sometimes this means putting out demonstrations or trials on the farms. Sometimes this means connecting to farmers to cost share and incentive programs. So I really think that we're passionate about ways to effectively drive change, and that's really best accomplished through partnerships and education.
So you're basically giving as much support as you can to farmers to achieve their sustainability objectives.
Exactly. I think it's all about the support system that we can provide.
Okay, well, and you mentioned there that you go actually on the farm, and we'll talk about that a bit later on because I think that's very interesting to hear. But what about you, Marty? I mean, I know that you've worked on a number of cotton-linked projects, so tell us more.
we started working with sustainable agriculture initiatives with Field to Market back in 2006, and that's 15 years ago now. It goes fast, doesn't it? Remember when 2000 was the big deal? Those of us of a certain age. So we started working with them 15 years ago with Field to Market, and Cotton Incorporated and the cotton growers were founding members of this multi-stakeholder organization committed to developing common metrics and common strategies for increasing sustainability across all of agriculture, and the cotton producers have been out front. So the work I've been doing is in helping develop those metrics that are effective at making things better. I want to make that clear. We have to agree on what needs to be better, and then we have to figure out how to make it better. So it sounds pretty simple in its framing, but even agreeing on what to make better is not that easy when we have a big, complex world. So Field to Market work with its multiple stakeholders across the supply chain, including conservation organizations like World Wildlife Fund, Environmental Defense Fund, Nature Conservancy, and others, and working with governments and universities and the growers, identified reducing soil erosion, increasing energy use efficiency, increasing water use efficiency, increasing yield, which reduces land impacts, reduces the impact on the lands, among other metrics. Those are the environmental metrics that we started with. And 15 years later, we have a fairly robust set of metrics for each crop. And now the cropping programs, each of our crop sectors are developing goals for continuous improvement. Continuous improvement is the key.
And when you say that the cotton producers were out front at the beginning, I mean, does that surprise you, or why was that? Why do you think that was?
It's not surprising in the sense that our agricultural producers generally uh, have to be progressive in order to survive in a very dynamic global market. So they're sort of the fact that they are innovators just means that they're succeeding and they're surviving because that's necessary. This is a really hard way to make a living. If you don't believe me, just go put in a garden. And just about the time the tomatoes are ready to harvest, watch the squirrels come and take them. So it is hard to make things from the land. It's really hard. So these producers are some of the most dedicated innovators on the planet. And that's one of our keys. Our keys is never to take that innovative strength away from the producers by never telling the producers how to produce. We agree on common goals, the things that we all want to make better, all meaning conservation organizations, industries, and consumers and the farmers. And then we let the farmers figure out how to make it better, working together. And that's
I
what the
think
power of this is.
I think it's interesting when you say the role of the innovator, because most people obviously just think of agriculture as being such a traditional thing, but it clearly isn't. Now, I know that you're both on the US Cotton Trust Protocol board, and the Trust Protocol is basing, of course, as you say, Marty, all its goals on scientific evidence. So it's interesting to know, really, how the academic understanding matches with what an organization like the Trust Protocol is actually trying to do. So, Marty, what would you say, and what are your observations when you're actually trying to match really the idea of the sort of metrics you're talking about and then the sort of metrics that the protocol is talking about? Do they match up?
They do. What the protocol is doing is it's giving the farmers a spotlight on their progress. It's celebrating the successes while also acknowledging, not only acknowledging, focusing on areas that continue to need improvement. Soil erosion is still a chronic problem for anyone who tills the land, anyone. And any farmer worth their salt hates to lose a gram of soil. They're losing their future. Every ounce of soil that runs off that land is a loss of their future, and they understand that. But having this partnership across the supply chain is new. Historically, these have been fairly siloed activities. Extension goes out and works with the farmers to get better. Researchers work with Extension and the farmers to figure out how to solve the problems that come from that. Now we have the entire supply chain, all the way down to consumer advocacy groups and the conservation organizations, feeding information and values back to the academic community, and it gives us a much more robust understanding of the challenges we face.
Yeah, it's really interesting to sort of think about the academic piece here. And so, Laurie, what about your research? How does that tie in with the sustainability goals of the Cotton Trust Protocol?
So, I mean, as we're all aware, the U.S. cotton industry set these sustainability targets for 2025, and they're all science-based. The target for greenhouse gas emissions is pegged to the Paris Climate Accord. So in terms of achieving those goals, U.S. Cotton has to continue to approach them with the same methodology that already made us a leader in responsibly grown cotton, utilizing a data-driven approach that relies on all of these innovative new technologies, the cutting-edge research coming out of the land grant system, as well as industry, in identification and adoption of best management practices. So academics are going to continue to encourage growers to adopt these new technologies that promote healthy soils, reduce our greenhouse gas emissions, and especially increasing our soil carbon. So the U.S. cotton industry, they maintain a producer-led research program, and that kind of goes back to what Marty was saying. The producers are out front in this. So those producers help advise us on where our research needs to go, on what challenges they're facing. And overall, the cotton industry in the U.S. invests more than $100 million per year on our research. And we're all committed, of course, to communicating that with U.S. growers, but also around the globe, so we can scale those practices and the conservation.
But is it very much a two-way flow, though? I mean, you say that the producers are advising you on the research, but I mean, are you also saying this is what you need to measure and that you are not measuring this? Maybe there are certain things that you think are not being measured.
Absolutely. It's a two-way street. We hear from the producers on challenges of adopting different conservation practices, and then we can go back to our labs and into our research trials and say, let's address these challenges. We want to make sure that conservation practices are able to be adopted, that they are logical, and that they help them maintain or increase their profitability.
So, Laurie, if we're looking at the whole business of sustainable agriculture around the globe, how does sustainably grown cotton fit into that? I mean, we heard from Marty before that the cotton industry was very much sort of, the cotton growers were very much sort of front and center of the whole sustainability movement early on.
Yeah, so most of the time, our farmers are growing more than just cotton. So when we're looking at conservation solutions, they have to fit their entire cropping system, their specific environment, their soils, their climate, and their goals. Each producer is going to have a different goal when it comes to sustainability and profitability. So this systems level, but farm and farmer specific approach kind of ensures that practices work logistically for them. So many times these environmental and economic improvements are seen through improved efficiencies of water, fertilizer, seed, pesticides, all of our inputs. To have more sustainably grown cotton, we have to be able to grow cotton, meaning we have to employ practices that meet both economic and environmental outcomes so we can keep our farmers in the fields.
So it's future proofing, it's making sure that profitability stays there.
Exactly. We have to keep our farmers farming.
Absolutely. So, Marty, then the textile industry in itself, it has an important role to play, doesn't it, in pursuing sustainability goals? So, how can the textile industry help to really make agricultural practices greener?
One of the challenges we had from the very beginning, this is even before 2006 with Field to Market, was this sense that we could impose all of these transformations on the farmer without cost. That we could make the farmer assume all the responsibilities for greenhouse gas emissions, for water quality, for erosion, for pesticide use, all of these things, which cost them money but don't give them more yield, and in fact reduce their resilience as an enterprise. And that we could, so there was this notion that that was their responsibility and not the supply chain's responsibility. That is to say, no one should have to pay for it. Well, someone pays for it, the farmer does. And so the inequity of that was clear. And that's why it took a transformation of thinking to get past that point, to recognize that everybody owns these problems. We all consume the products from the land, all of us. We wear them, we consume them, we use them in our daily lives. And so what we've been able to do with our supply chain discussions, our multi-stakeholder discussions, is elevate this recognition that somebody's got to pay, and who pays? All of us pay, because we all benefit. We're trying to reduce impacts on humanity. That means humanity needs to pay. And so the way we pay is through at the consumer product level, largely. And so that means there has to be some recognition of the value in the system to making these improvements. So what we've got to do is we've got to set up a framework that is critical for the U.S., but also can be modeled in other places to make life better for the farmers in other places and to reduce global impacts in other places. So that's really the value of this, and this is why the less than engaged garment manufacturer is going to buy the cheapest thread they can buy. And they're going to buy it from wherever they can get it cheap. And they're not going to be concerned about the consequences of upstream impacts, whether there was slave labor used in its production, for example, or chemicals that are no longer allowed by the UN in its production. And so they take no responsibility for that. They're just buying thread. Well, no, what they're doing is they're buying thread that has all of those encumbered burdens on it. So making it clear to the entire supply chain, included the garment branded products, that they own this problem too, and it's not just the farmers, was a major breakthrough. And I have to tell you, Jason Clay of the World Wildlife Fund was probably the most effective spokesperson, because he made this point from a conservation, sort of a third party perspective outside of the supply chain, that we all own it. And so Jason really transformed this conversation 15 years ago.
Well, yeah, no, I can see that the importance of the supply chain just linking up all the way along, and as you say, everyone taking their responsibility. And so let's go out into the fields now, Laurie, because you were referring to the fact that you are not an academic just in an ivory tower. You are actually going out onto the farms. I don't know whether you can still do it at the moment, actually, Laurie. I mean, getting your hands dirty out in the fields, but it must be very important to you.
Absolutely. Like I said before, I think relationships and communication is key. Working for the extension portion of the U.S. land grant system, like Marty mentioned earlier, we have staff in every local county that builds relationships with the farmers. So I'm not able to build an individual relationship with every farmer across my state that I serve, but by using that network, we can scale our communication of our newest research in the ivory towers, quickly and effectively through the staff at the county levels. Using data and tools from field to market, that makes our sustainability assessments so much more accessible to the farmers that we work with. That gives us the opportunity to address pitfalls and make more data-driven decisions around what practices need to be adopted on the farm. I've also found that conducting research trials on farm is a much more effective way of demonstrating specific practices to farmers. That way we can work through the logistics, the challenges, and the costs together. These farmers that participate in on-farm university trials often then become champions for the effort. They assist us in education and outreach opportunities with other farmers. So we really appreciate every opportunity to get in the fields, to be on the farm. To really scale our impacts.
And what do you hear from farmers themselves? Because we've talked about this before, that sometimes there's a bureaucratic element to all this, the metrics, and some people it's been a bit of a struggle for some farmers to deal with that, but there are many that are just embracing it because, as you say, that in the end it's about profitability. But what sort of return are you getting from the farmers?
Yeah, so sometimes they're surprised at their assessments. Most of the time, they're not. I mean, they know what's going on in their fields. It's very interesting to see them compare themselves to their neighbors. So when they see the comparison to their state benchmarks and the national benchmarks, then that really drives home, hey, maybe I have an issue here in my energy use or greenhouse gas emissions or soil loss. And what are my neighbors doing that I'm not, to drive these changes?
So what about you, Marty, then? Are you going out and meeting farmers quite a lot?
Absolutely. The way you make the world more sustainable from agriculture is by informing and influencing the decisions that farmers make every morning. And if otherwise, it's just talk. They take the actions that transform the world. We just talk. So we have to actually have those relationships, because the fact is, every farm is a different enterprise with different driving forces, different risk management strategies. And so the way I worked with our farmers is through small group engagement on the farms where possible, bringing in conservation organizations, so that and bringing in organizations that are historically anti-genetically modified crops, for example, or other other groups that have concerns about agricultural production practices. We brought European producers to our farms to show them how we produce, and we're showing them how, because, and then we've also spent time in other countries explaining how our farmers manage the multiple risks and challenges of production, and among those, climate change is one of the more imminent ones for them, and how they've been able to address those. How integrating these decision-making processes has increased their farm resiliency. It may cost them a little bit of yield, but they actually get more profit. And so optimizing yield to maximize profit is the business model of farms. There's this notion it's maximizing yield. No, maximizing yield is a bad business model. Maximizing profit is a good business model, and it's also a good sustainability model. That's where conservation tillage, for example, is critical. So going to the farms and building relationship with individual farmers is absolutely the beginning of this. And I encourage anyone who's interested in this process anywhere in the supply chain, to build these relationships. Work with the farm organizations. Find a couple of gregarious farmers, and they're actually more common than you might think. And go have a cup of coffee with them at their kitchen table and talk to, because their day's busy. You got to start early. Talk to them about what they're doing and why, what their last failure was, what their last great success was, and how they make those decisions.
Let's just talk about the trust protocol itself, Laurie, because an initiative like this, how do you think, what role does it play really in linking your research with the growers?
The trust protocol and other efforts like that are fantastic in that they're documenting and telling the great story of our U.S. cotton growers. So it's doing that, but it's also ensuring that we're driving continuous improvement on the ground. So like Marty said earlier, we need to tell our good story. We need to show the improvements that we have made, especially over the last 60, 70 years in the U.S., but also being able to identify the issues on the ground and the areas for improvement. So, like I mentioned earlier, when a farmer sees their field print and they can benchmark themselves against other growers, or they can benchmark themselves over time and actually see improvements in the sustainability metrics, that opens up a lot of questions. So the ability for us to link our research on best management practices to the specific metric that the producer is concerned with, I think is key to this, to tying academics and education to the trust protocol.
And do you think that the public perception is also shifting now, that people are starting to see cotton as more of an eco-friendly fiber than perhaps was in the past?
I think so. I'm a millennial, so I've seen all of the consumer research on purchasing, and in the past, we've said that millennials especially don't want to pay more for a sustainable fiber, but we see cotton as the most sustainable fiber. So I think we're seeing a shift, especially with the generations after the millennials.
And Marty, just what are your thoughts generally then on the role of the trust protocol in this, in terms of linking research with growers?
I think that we have a better sense of our big common challenges than we've had in my career. And I think we have an alignment of resources to address those big challenges more aggressively than ever in my career. So U.S. agriculture has a commitment to take carbon from the atmosphere and put it in the soil where it belongs. We are seeing increased soil organic carbon across U.S. agricultural lands at increasing rates, to the point that we've returned more carbon to the soil than we've had since the 1950s. So a 60, 70-year reversal of mining carbon from the soil. And so now we're not done yet. We just think we're just figuring out how it works. Now we're going to start implementing at a full scale. And the tools we have are fairly familiar to farmers: conservation tillage, cover crops, but there are other tools, extensive nutrient management in the soil beyond just for agronomic purposes. Now we have to manage nutrients for soil purposes, to make the soil the healthy ecosystem that it is, that's necessary for resilient crop production. We understanding the role of intermittent tillage versus constant no-till or low-till. Those are things we don't know yet, that because the system is incredibly complex, and latitude and longitude matter, location matters. So all of those variables are starting to come into focus, at least for us, for those of us engaged in the academic research part. We now know more clearly than we have before where our challenges are. So it's been an incredibly positive transformation of our understanding.
So, of course, there'll be more goals set by the Trust Protocol for 2030 and 2050. So I'm sure we will be talking about that at some point. But I think we will wrap up at this point. But I'd like to thank you both very much indeed, because it's really interesting to hear how the whole world of academia and dare I say, the real world out there, the world out there in the fields, are actually coming together and really making such a big contribution to sustainable development. So thank you both very much indeed. That's it for this edition of the US Cotton Trust Protocol Smarter Conversations podcast, and you can learn more about the Trust Protocol at trustuscotton.org.